It was May 10, 2001, and the air in Bloomington, Indiana carried that restless scent of summer, a mix of cut grass, hot asphalt, and freedom. Students spilled out of lecture halls, shouting goodbyes, throwing papers in the air. For most, it was the end of a semester. For Martha Hayes, it was supposed to be the beginning of everything. At 21, Martha had that kind of presence people remembered, not because she was loud, but because she was steady. A journalism major with wide hazel eyes and a notebook always in hand, she believed in stories that mattered. She often said, "If I can't find the truth, I'll make sure it finds me." Her roommate, Emily Carter, used to laugh at that. "Only you could make honesty sound like an adventure," Emily teased, brushing chalk dust from her hands after a long shift at the campus cafe. Martha grinned. "It is an adventure. One day, I'll be chasing senators or covering courtrooms in D.C. That afternoon, she took her last final, Media Law, room 304, Franklin Hall. She emerged into the golden light, exhausted but glowing. She waved to Ryan Moore, her study partner, who lingered near the steps. "You did it," he said, pushing his glasses up. "No more caffeine-fueled nights or deadlines." "Don't remind me," Martha laughed. "I'm heading home, taking the longest nap in history." Ryan hesitated. "There's a party later at the Sigma House. You should come." "Maybe," she said, tightening her backpack strap. "If I don't fall asleep first." That was the last confirmed conversation anyone had with her. When the sun began to dip, Bloomington transformed, laughter echoing through the streets, car radios humming with summer songs, the smell of grilled food drifting from porches. Martha's apartment was only a 15-minute walk from campus, past the oak-lined paths and the small bookstore she loved. She was supposed to call her dad once she got home. She never did. Hours later, Emily noticed her bed untouched, the window open, the faint smell of rain drifting in. It was after midnight when she picked up the phone and whispered, "Martha's not back yet." The police would later record that call as time of first report, 12:47 a.m., May 11th, 2001. No one knew it then, but that single line would become the starting point of a mystery that would stretch across decades and shatter a quiet college town. Before we continue deeper into this case, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. These stories of truth, loss, and resolution deserve to be heard, and your support helps us bring them to light. The next morning, Detective Aaron Blake arrived at the small apartment complex off Dunn Street. He was 27 then, new to the department, his badge still shining like an idea not yet tarnished. "Missing student?" he asked the officer on duty. "Yeah," the officer said, flipping through his notepad. "Name's Martha Hayes, no sign of struggle." "No witnesses so far." Blake looked at the photo pinned to the report, Martha smiling under a wide Indiana sky. He couldn't have known that her disappearance would define his life. Outside, thunder rolled softly in the distance, and the first drops of rain began to fall, washing over the empty sidewalks where she was last seen. By the next morning, Bloomington's bright calm had turned uneasy. Posters from last week's graduation party still clung to telephone poles, fluttering in the wind like silent witnesses. But now, another kind of paper began to spread, missing person flyers with Martha Hayes' face printed in urgent black and white. Emily Carter hadn't slept. She sat at their kitchen table, clutching Martha's spare key, her heart pounding with guilt. Every creak of the hallway made her look up. When Detective Aaron Blake knocked on the door, she jumped. "Emily Carter?" he asked gently. "You were her roommate." She nodded, eyes red. "She never came home. I called her. I must have called a dozen times." "Any idea where she might have gone after her exam?" She mentioned walking home. "Maybe stopping by the bookstore," Emily said, her voice trembling. "She wasn't the type to just disappear." Blake wrote quickly in his notebook. "Did she have any plans that night? A party, maybe?" Emily hesitated. Ryan Moore invited her to one, but she wasn't sure she'd go. Blake looked up. "Ryan Moore. That name's come up before." Outside, the first group of volunteers gathered. Students, professors, and neighbors, all combing nearby trails and empty lots. Someone from the journalism department brought stacks of posters. Tom Hayes arrived from their hometown, his old pickup coated in highway dust. When he stepped out, he looked smaller, like the miles had already drained him. "She called me every night," he said quietly, gripping a photo of Martha as a child. "Every night, Detective. She wouldn't just stop." The police began searching the wooded area near the university, following the path Martha usually took home. Dogs sniffed the damp soil, their handlers silent, focused. Nothing. Not a shoe, not a torn page, not even a footprint. As dusk approached, the sky burned orange and then turned the color of rust. The streetlights buzzed to life, one by one. Emily stood near the library steps, staring at the last place she'd seen her friend alive. Ryan Moore showed up, face pale, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. "They think I did something," he muttered. Emily glanced at him sharply. "Did you?" He looked away. "Of course not. She was my friend, too." Blake watched from a distance, noting their tense exchange. Something about Ryan's demeanor felt off. Not panic, not grief, but unease, like someone who knew more than he could say. That night, local news stations aired Martha's photo for the first time. The anchor's voice was calm but heavy. "Indiana University student Martha Hayes has been reported missing since Thursday evening. Police urge anyone with information to come forward." Tom sat on the motel bed, watching the screen in silence. The image showed Martha laughing beside a notebook, a pen tucked behind her ear, alive, vibrant, caught forever in a moment that now belonged to the past. In the police station, Detective Blake pinned her photo above his desk. Beneath it, he wrote one word: truth. The search had only just begun, and already the case was twisting into something larger than anyone expected. By the third day, Bloomington's quiet normalcy had cracked. Patrol cars rolled through empty streets, their sirens muted but their presence heavy. Students whispered in hallways. Professors paused lectures to check attendance lists. It was as if the entire town had developed the same heartbeat, fast, anxious, and searching. Detective Aaron Blake sat in the department's small conference room, surrounded by half-drunk coffee cups and stacks of witness reports. He'd gone through them 3 times already. None of it made sense. One student swore they'd seen Martha near a gas station off 3rd Street around 6 p.m. Another insisted she was walking along the highway at sunset, wearing her backpack. Neither account matched the timeline. Blake rubbed his temples. 2 different sides of town, 2 different times. Someone's lying, or someone's guessing. Officer Daniels, his partner, shrugged. Or they both just want to be part of the story. Blake stared at the map pinned to the wall, red pins marking every supposed sighting. They formed no pattern, no logic, just chaos. That afternoon, he called Ryan Moore back in for another interview. Ryan arrived looking tired, dark circles under his eyes, his hands fidgeting with a pen. "I told you everything I know," Ryan said. "We talked after class. She said she was going home, that's it." "You said that before," Blake replied evenly, "but your timeline doesn't line up with other witness statements. You said she left Franklin Hall around 4. Another student saw her closer to 5:30. Ryan's jaw tightened. "Then they're wrong. I know what time it was. I remember the clock." Blake leaned forward. "You and Martha were close." "We worked on the same projects. She was smart, maybe too serious sometimes." "Did you ever argue?" Ryan hesitated. "Everyone argues, but nothing big. She didn't like when people didn't take things seriously." Blake's eyes narrowed. "What things?" Ryan looked away. "Truth, responsibility. Journalism stuff." Outside, a storm gathered over the town, wind brushing against the station windows. Blake watched Ryan leave, uneasy. Something about his answers felt rehearsed, clipped, too careful. Meanwhile, Emily and Tom continued searching. They went door to door, handing out flyers at gas stations, grocery stores, and coffee shops. Strangers offered sympathy, not solutions. Each night ended the same. No calls, no sightings, no trace. On Saturday morning, a tip came in. A woman claimed she saw a girl matching Martha's description at a rest stop 30 miles west, traveling with a man in a red pickup truck. Blake drove out immediately. The woman described the girl's long hair, her anxious eyes, the way she kept glancing at the door. For a brief, trembling moment, hope flickered. But when they checked the security footage, the girl wasn't Martha. Just another student, another life intersecting by coincidence. That night, Blake sat alone in his car outside the station, rain streaking down the windshield. His radio crackled with static. He whispered to himself, "Where did you go, Martha?" Inside his pocket, he carried one of the missing posters folded neatly, the same photo of her smiling, notebook in hand. Every lead felt like smoke, vanishing the moment he reached for it. And deep down, he began to fear this was no ordinary disappearance. By late July, Bloomington had grown heavy with heat and silence. The trees stood still, cicadas droned endlessly, and Martha Hayes's name had begun to fade from the news tickers that once flashed it hourly. What remained were posters curled by the sun, their corners torn by wind, each one a quiet question the town no longer knew how to answer. Detective Aaron Blake still arrived at the station before sunrise. The case folder sat open on his desk, its pages worn from constant handling. He read the same lines again and again, as if repetition could force meaning into them. There was nothing new to find, just a trail of exhaustion and empty roads. His captain stepped in one morning, a coffee in hand. "Blake, we've done everything. We can't keep pouring hours into a case that's gone cold." Blake looked up, eyes shadowed. "She didn't just vanish. Someone knows something." "Maybe," the captain said softly, "but sometimes the trail dies before the truth does." He walked away, leaving Blake with the steady hum of fluorescent lights and the ache of failure. Meanwhile, Tom Hayes had turned his garage into a shrine of hope. The walls were lined with newspaper clippings, maps and phone numbers scribbled in fading ink. Each week, he drove to a new county, chasing rumors of sightings that never led anywhere. The road blurred into habit, gas stations, coffee cups, polite rejections. "Dad," his sister Claire said one evening over the phone, "you have to rest. You can't keep living like this." Tom's voice cracked. "She's my daughter, Claire. If I stop looking, what am I?" Emily Carter, too, carried the weight in silence. She'd moved back home for the summer, trying to escape the hollow apartment that still smelled faintly of Martha's shampoo and pencil shavings. Her nights were restless, filled with flashes of memory, laughter over late-night pizza, Martha scribbling quotes on sticky notes, the sound of her keys jingling as she left one last time. Sometimes Emily thought she heard footsteps in the hall. Every time she opened the door, there was nothing but the echo of her own heartbeat. By August, the official investigation had been suspended. The word cold felt cruel, a word that didn't belong to summer, or to a girl who had once been so alive. The case file was boxed and shelved, tagged with a number that meant little to anyone except Aaron Blake. He refused to let it go, keeping a copy of every report locked in his desk drawer. On the night the case was closed, he sat alone in his car outside the Hayes' home. The porch light flickered weakly, and through the window he saw Tom sitting at the kitchen table, staring at an untouched cup of coffee. Blake wanted to knock, to promise he'd keep looking. But what comfort could an empty vow bring? As he drove away, the air outside shimmered with heat and sorrow. Somewhere behind him, the candlelight vigil began. Dozens of students gathered in silence, holding photos that flickered in the summer breeze. It was supposed to be a night of remembrance. Instead, it felt like a beginning disguised as an ending. Years slipped quietly into decades, and what had once been a town haunted by whispers of Martha Hayes' disappearance became a place that rarely spoke her name aloud. The posters had long disintegrated, the news segments forgotten, but the absence she left behind never truly settled. It lingered and invisible but felt, like humidity before a storm. Detective Aaron Blake, now retired, kept her file in a worn cardboard box in his garage. The ink had faded, and the photos had yellowed around the edges. He still remembered the exact sound of Tom Hayes' voice that night, rough and hollow, when he said, "Please don't stop looking." Blake hadn't. He just didn't know what else there was to find. Every few months he'd take the box down, spreading the papers across his kitchen table like a ritual. He'd trace the dates, the statements, the empty spaces where answers should have been. Then he'd close it all again, convincing himself he'd stopped caring. But the truth was, the case had become part of him, a ghost that aged alongside him. Across the state line in Illinois, Emily Carter had built a quieter life. She became a high school English teacher, known for her patience and the stack of books she carried everywhere. To her students, she was calm and reliable. But when the hallways emptied, she would sit at her desk, stare at the empty chair across from her and remember. Her apartment walls were bare, except for a single photo framed above her desk. 2 girls laughing outside the Franklin Hall steps, sunlight spilling over their faces. It was easier to keep the memory alive than to confront the reality that Martha was gone. Once a year, she returned to Bloomington for the vigil. The crowd grew smaller over time. A few friends, aging professors, and Tom Hayes, who never missed one. His hair had gone grey, his hands stiff, but he still lit the candle the same way he had 20 years ago, whispering, "We're still waiting, kiddo." He still ran the small auto shop, still kept Martha's old notebook on the shelf above his workbench. Its cover was cracked, the pages faintly smelling of ink and dust. He'd open it sometimes, not to read, but to feel closer to her, to remember the neat handwriting and the margin notes about stories she wanted to tell. The town around them changed, new stores, new faces, new rhythms. The university expanded, and students walked the same paths Martha once did, unaware of the story that had unfolded there. Only the old library steps seemed untouched, holding the memory in silence. For some, time heals. For others, it only stretches the wound until it becomes part of who they are. Emily carried it in the pauses between her sentences, Blake in the sleepless hours before dawn, Tom in the ache that came with each sunrise, and somewhere beneath all that silence, the truth remained, buried, but not gone. By the spring of 2029, true crime podcasts had become America's newest obsession, and among them was Silent Tracks, hosted by investigative journalist Linda Cooper. She had a knack for unearthing forgotten stories, the ones that had slipped through time's cracks. When a listener sent her a short email titled Martha Hayes, Unsolved 2001 Disappearance, Indiana University, something about it gripped her. Linda read through the old newspaper articles late into the night, her apartment glowing with the cold light of her laptop. A young woman vanishes after her last college exam, no trace, no closure, and 2 decades of silence. It was exactly the kind of mystery she built her career around. But there was something different about Martha's story. It wasn't just the mystery. It was the people left behind, still waiting. She picked up the phone and called the number listed for Tom Hayes' old garage. The voice that answered was weary but polite. "Hayes Auto," he said. "Mr. Hayes, my name's Linda Cooper. I'm a journalist. I'm doing a series on long-term missing person cases. I'd like to talk about your daughter." There was a long pause. "It's been 28 years, Tom said slowly. What's left to say?" "Maybe not much," Linda replied. "But sometimes new questions open old doors." He agreed to meet. When Linda arrived in Bloomington, the air was thick with the smell of rain and blooming lilacs. The town looked different now, cleaner, busier, but it still carried that old quiet. Tom met her in the workshop, surrounded by tools and the low hum of an engine cooling. On the wall behind him, Martha's photo hung beside a calendar that hadn't been turned since March. "She was supposed to call me that night," he said, eyes on the picture. "I still check the phone some mornings. Don't know why." Linda recorded everything, her small microphone blinking red. Later, she visited the police archives, speaking with officers who had retired years earlier. One name came up again and again, Detective Aaron Blake. She found him in a modest house on the edge of town. He was older, slower, but when she mentioned Martha Hayes, the years fell from his face. "I've still got the file," he said, voice rough. "You can't work a case that long and just walk away." He let her see the box, old photos, interview notes, evidence tags. And at the very bottom, a cassette tape labeled Ryan Moore, statement May 2001. "Was this ever reviewed?" Linda asked. "Sure," Blake said, frowning. "But we never had the full recording, only the transcript. The tape was logged as missing." Linda turned the tape in her hands, her pulse quickening. "Then where did this come from?" "It wasn't there before," Blake murmured. That box hasn't been touched in years. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, something had shifted. The faint sound of a locked door beginning to open. The cassette tape sat on Linda Cooper's desk, its clear plastic casing glinting under the lamplight. The label, faded but legible, read, "Ryan Moore, Statement May 14, 2001. She turned it over in her hand again, trying to understand how something missing for 28 years could suddenly reappear. Her gut told her it wasn't chance. She found an old recorder at a thrift store, the kind with chunky grey buttons and a faint smell of dust. When she pressed play, a hiss of static filled the room, followed by a hesitant male voice, Ryan's. "I already told the officers everything," he began. "We finished the exam around 4, walked out together, talked for a minute. Then I left. She said she was going home. That's it." A pause, then a faint sound of shuffling papers. Ryan's tone shifted slightly. "Look, she was tired. Maybe she just needed a break. You don't know her like I did." Linda leaned closer. There was a scratch in the tape, but beneath it she caught something else. The click of a lighter, the sound of rain, and then words that weren't in the official transcript. "She said she was meeting someone," Ryan murmured. "But she didn't say who." Linda froze. That line had never been documented. She rewound and played it again, certain she hadn't misheard. Meeting someone. The next morning she called Detective Aaron Blake. "You need to hear this," she said. When he arrived, he listened in silence, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. When the tape ended, he exhaled slowly. "That wasn't in any of our notes. He told us she went straight home." "Exactly," Linda said. "Either the transcript was edited or someone removed part of it." Blake rubbed his jaw. "Back in 2001, we didn't digitize evidence. Everything was physical, tapes, paper files. Things got lost, misplaced, or hidden." "Hidden?" Linda pressed. He didn't answer. Together they went to the Bloomington Police Department storage facility, a sprawling building that smelled of concrete and coal dust. The archivist led them down a corridor of metal shelves stacked with old boxes. When Blake gave the case number, the man frowned. "That file was checked out once in 2008, he said. "Signed by an officer named Peterson, retired years ago." Blake stiffened. "Peterson worked under me, but he never mentioned it." They located the sign-out sheet, and beside the officer's name was a second signature, Ryan Moore's. Linda stared at the page, disbelief tightening her chest. "Why would a witness have access to his own statement?" "Because someone let him," Blake said darkly, "and that means the trail we thought was cold might have been buried on purpose." When they stepped outside, the afternoon sun was low, throwing long shadows across the parking lot. For the first time in years, Blake felt that familiar pulse of adrenaline, the hum of possibility. He turned to Linda. "We're reopening this officially." Linda nodded, recording on her phone. "Then let's start where it all began, with the man who said he had nothing left to tell." 2 weeks after discovering the tape, Linda Cooper sat in the cold case office, surrounded by boxes marked Evidence, 2001. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the air, steady and sterile. Detective Aaron Blake stood beside her, sleeves rolled up, eyes sharp again after years of dull resignation. For the first time in decades, they had a direction. The Bloomington Police Department authorized a forensic re-examination of every item collected back then. Technology had evolved far beyond what they'd had in 2001, and what once seemed useless might now tell a story. "Start with anything found along her walking route," Blake said, scanning an inventory sheet. "We missed something, I can feel it." They opened a sealed box labeled Warehouse District. Items collected 5/15/01. Inside were photographs, soil samples, and a fragment of fabric that had never been conclusively linked to Martha. Back then, DNA analysis couldn't do much with partial or degraded material. But in 2029 it could. Linda ran her hand over the evidence bag. "It was near that abandoned warehouse, right?" "Yeah," Blake said. "Kids used to hang out there. We searched the area, found nothing. It was written off as irrelevant." She shook her head. "Nothing's irrelevant anymore." The new forensics team processed the sample, running it through a national DNA database. When the results came back 3 days later, the lab technician called Blake directly. "There's a partial match," the the voice said through the receiver. "Two profiles. One belongs to Martha Hayes. The other, we're still confirming, but it's consistent with Ryan Moore." Blake's breath caught. He repeated the words slowly as if they might vanish if he spoke them too fast. "So you're sure? Positive match probability above 98%. Same location, same sample." When he hung up, Linda was watching him closely. "What is it?" He leaned on the desk, voice low. "We've got him. Ryan was there." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of the air conditioner filled the silence, a low hum that somehow made the revelation heavier. Linda exhaled shakily. "We just tied him to the last known location connected to her case." Blake nodded. "And we're going to make it public." That night, she recorded a new episode of Silent Tracks. Her voice was calm, measured, but beneath it burned a quiet intensity. "After 28 years," she said into the microphone, "DNA evidence has confirmed a direct link between missing student Martha Hayes and a former classmate, Ryan Moore. For decades, the case stood still, but the truth, it seems, has been waiting in a sealed evidence box." The episode exploded online. Social media flooded with theories, support, outrage. Local news picked up the story within hours, and suddenly Bloomington was alive with a name it hadn't spoken in years: Martha Hayes. Detective Blake watched the coverage from his living room, the same flickering photo of Martha filling the screen. The world was finally looking again. He whispered to himself, almost like a promise, "We're coming for you, Ryan." When the arrest warrant was issued, Bloomington held its breath. The name printed across the top of the document felt unreal: Ryan Moore. To most people, he was a respected editor now, living quietly in Chicago, married, father of two. To those who remembered 2001, he was the last person seen with Martha Hayes, a name long buried but never forgotten. Detective Aaron Blake stood in the back of the briefing room as the Chicago police prepared the arrest team. His hands were steady, but inside him ran the tremor of 28 years' worth of waiting. Linda Cooper was there too, press badge clipped to her jacket, her recorder tucked away but ready. She wasn't allowed to film the operation, but she didn't need to. The story was already alive, beating through every headline, every podcast feed, every message board thread. At precisely 8:42 a.m., officers approached Ryan's suburban home. He answered the door still in his dress shirt, confusion flashing across his face as he saw the badges. "Ryan Moore," an officer said, "you're under arrest for the 2001 disappearance of Martha Hayes." Ryan's expression shifted, disbelief first, then something more controlled, practiced. "That's insane," he said, voice tight. "This was cleared decades ago." Blake stepped forward, his tone calm but unyielding. "It wasn't cleared, Ryan, it was forgotten. And that's not the same thing." Neighbors peered from windows as the news spread down the street. The image of Ryan in handcuffs hit social media within hours. A man whose life had seemed ordinary, now unraveling in real time. Back in Bloomington, Tom Hayes sat alone in his kitchen when the call came. "Mr. Hayes," Blake said, voice careful, "we made an arrest this morning." Tom closed his eyes, the receiver trembling in his hand. For a moment, the world went quiet, just the hum of the refrigerator and the echo of his daughter's laughter in memory. "After all this time," he whispered, "I thought I'd never hear those words." Emily Carter found out later that afternoon while grading essays. A co-worker knocked on her classroom door, holding up her phone. "Emily, you need to see this." She stared at the screen, Ryan's face, older now, weary, escorted into a police car. Her throat tightened, the room spinning with old echoes. She'd spent years wondering if she'd imagined her unease around him, if guilt had blurred her judgment. Now she knew. Meanwhile, Linda watched the footage play across national news. Her podcast had started a chain reaction no one could stop now. She'd wanted truth, but truth was never clean. It hurt everyone it touched. Blake sat in his car outside the station that night, the radio murmuring updates about the case he had lived and breathed for half his life. He thought about the first day he'd seen Martha's photo, the candlelight vigils, the unanswered calls. Now there was an answer, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like the beginning of something heavier, something final. He whispered into the quiet, "We've got him, Martha, now let's finish this." The interrogation room smelled of stale coffee and paper, the kind of sterile, cold environment meant to make a person feel small. Ryan Moore sat across from Detective Aaron Blake, his hands cuffed to the table, his expression strained but composed. He had barely spoken a word since his arrest, but now the silence between them felt heavy, loaded with the weight of years, of secrets that had refused to stay buried. Blake watched him closely, his voice calm but firm. "You know why you're here, Ryan. You know what you did." Ryan shifted in his seat, his jaw tight, his eyes darting to the corner of the room as if searching for an escape. "I didn't do anything wrong. This is all a mistake. Martha she just disappeared. I had nothing to do with it." Blake leaned forward, his gaze unyielding. "Then explain to me why, after all these years, your DNA was found in the exact location where she was last seen. Explain why your statement from 2001 didn't match what you told us on that tape. Why did you hide the truth?" Ryan's breath hitched. He swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly. "I didn't mean to. It was an accident. I didn't mean for it to happen." Blake's eyes narrowed. "An accident? Tell me what happened, Ryan. Tell me what really happened that night." For a long moment, Ryan didn't speak. His eyes glazed over, lost in the memory. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he began, "It wasn't supposed to go like that. We were just talking. She was upset. We had a disagreement about the final exam, about our future. She was always so serious, so focused, and I wasn't. I didn't care. I just wanted to be done with it, with school, with everything. I didn't want to deal with her asking questions, pushing me to care." Blake stayed silent, allowing him to continue. "She pushed me, and I pushed her back. I didn't think it was that bad. But she fell, hit her head on the ground, and she didn't move after that." Ryan's voice broke, and for the first time Blake saw the raw pain behind his eyes. "I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't even sure if she was dead, but I couldn't let anyone find out. I couldn't go to jail, so He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Blake's heart tightened, but he didn't look away. "So you hid her, Ryan. You left her there, and you never came back." Ryan nodded slowly, his face pale, tears now streaming down his face. "I didn't know what to do. I just kept telling myself it was over, but it never was. Every year I thought about it. Every time someone mentioned her name, every time someone asked about her, it ate me alive." Blake's voice softened slightly, but it was still heavy with the weight of what had just been revealed. "You thought you could run from this, but the truth never stays buried, Ryan." "It never does." Ryan sank back into his chair, his shoulders sagging with the weight of his confession. The years of guilt, of trying to outrun a truth that wouldn't let him go, had finally caught up with him. The room was quiet, save for the soft sound of his sobs, a sound Blake had been waiting to hear for almost 3 decades. The search for Martha Hayes had ended with her name, her memory, now tethered to a warehouse where no one had thought to look. On the day her remains were found, the sky was overcast, a thick blanket of clouds pressing down over Bloomington. It felt like the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for the closure that had eluded them for so long. Detective Aaron Blake stood at the edge of the crime scene, his eyes scanning the area. The forensic team moved carefully, marking every inch of the ground. A few feet away, Tom Hayes stood with his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his face ashen but resolute. He had waited so long for this moment, for the day when his daughter's name would be cleared from the fog of uncertainty. Blake approached him quietly. "We found her, Tom." Tom's response was almost imperceptible, a single nod, his gaze fixed on the ground, his breath shallow. He wasn't sure whether to feel relief or sorrow. How could anyone? His daughter was gone, but at least she wasn't lost anymore. The body had been buried in a shallow grave covered with the remnants of an old tarp. The identification was immediate. The clothing, the shoes, the way she was positioned. It was Martha. Blake didn't need the DNA results to confirm it. The moment he saw her, he knew. Tom didn't ask for the details. He didn't need to know how she had died. The answers to those questions didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that she had been found. The years of wondering, of hoping against hope, had finally led to this. That night, the town of Bloomington held a memorial. It wasn't large, a quiet gathering, mostly locals, a few people who had known Martha during her time at Indiana University. Emily Carter stood at the back, her arms crossed, watching as the crowd shared memories of Martha, how she had always been the first to speak up in class, her enthusiasm for journalism, how she believed in uncovering the truth. Tom spoke briefly, his voice steady but filled with a quiet sadness. "My daughter was a fighter. She didn't give up on what she believed in. And I'll never give up on her memory." Emily wiped a tear from her cheek. It had taken her years to come to terms with her own guilt, with the feeling that she had abandoned Martha in those final moments. But now, standing in front of the memorial, surrounded by the town and Martha's legacy, Emily could feel the weight of the past begin to lift. Blake watched the ceremony from the outskirts, his hand resting on the file in his jacket. He had promised himself that he would never forget Martha's face, never stop searching. And now, as he stood in the same place where she had disappeared all those years ago, he understood something crucial. Sometimes finding the truth wasn't about bringing justice alone. Sometimes it was about bringing peace. The wind stirred, carrying with it the first whispers of fall. A moment of stillness passed, and then, as the crowd began to disperse, Blake whispered to himself, "You're finally home, Martha." The courtroom was filled with a heavy tension that had been building for years. On the wooden benches, friends, family, and strangers alike filled the seats, waiting for what they knew would be a historic trial. The story of Martha Hayes had become a haunting memory, a mystery that had lingered for far too long. But now, finally, the truth was being put on display. Ryan Moore stood at the defendant's table, his eyes hollow, his shoulders hunched. He was a man broken not just by the law, but by the weight of his own guilt. His lawyer sat beside him, speaking softly, but Ryan wasn't listening. His mind was elsewhere, lost in the events of that night, the confession he had given so many months ago, and the wreckage he had created. Across from him, Tom Hayes sat stoically, his face unreadable. His wife Claire sat beside him, holding his hand. There was a quiet strength in their silence. They had waited a lifetime for this day, and now that it had arrived, they found no joy in it. They had wanted answers, but the answers had come with a price. Emily Carter was in the audience too, her eyes locked on Ryan. She had always known something wasn't right, but now, seeing him in the courtroom, hearing the truth in full, she felt the weight of their shared history, how everything had changed the night Martha disappeared. She wanted to believe that justice would make it right, but she knew deep down that there was no real closure. The prosecution was clear in their case. Ryan Moore had killed Martha Hayes in a violent outburst, and his attempt to cover up the crime had turned her disappearance into a haunting mystery for nearly 3 decades. The evidence was overwhelming. The DNA match, the forensic evidence, and, most devastating of all, the confession Ryan had given to Detective Blake. When the defense finally presented its case, it was clear that they had no real argument to make. There was no denying Ryan's guilt, only the question of how much responsibility he should bear. His lawyer painted him as a young man who had panicked, who had been overwhelmed by fear and regret. It was an attempt to humanize him, to show that he was more than the monster the public had made him out to be. But the words fell flat. No one in the courtroom could look at Ryan and see a young man who had made a mistake. They only saw the man who had taken Martha's life and shattered the lives of everyone who had loved her. The closing arguments were brief. The prosecution urged the jury to deliver a verdict that matched the gravity of Ryan's actions. The defense pleaded for leniency, citing Ryan's remorse and the years of torment he had endured. But as the jury filed out to deliberate, the truth was undeniable. Ryan Moore had taken a life, and he would pay the price. As the trial drew to a close, Detective Blake stood quietly at the back of the room. His role in the case had come full circle. He had never given up on finding Martha, even when it seemed impossible. But now, as the case was finally coming to an end, he felt a strange emptiness. Not satisfaction, not relief, but a quiet, painful understanding that some things, once broken, can never truly be fixed. The trial was over, and with it the town of Bloomington began to stir with a new sense of life. But the ripple effects were still being felt by everyone involved. The courtroom, once heavy with tension, had cleared, but the weight of the verdict lingered. Justice had been served, but the price was steep, not just for Ryan Moore but for everyone who had waited for so long. Ryan had been sentenced to life in prison, his appeals rejected. His life, once full of promises and quiet achievements, was now reduced to a singular moment in time, a moment he could never escape. The eyes of the public, once sympathetic to his remorse, had now turned cold, as they always do when the truth is too much to bear. For Detective Aaron Blake, the closure was a bittersweet victory. He had spent decades chasing the truth, never letting go of the file, never allowing himself to believe that Martha was simply another lost case. But now that the mystery was solved, Blake found himself at a loss. What now? What did a man like him do after finding the truth? After the decades of searching, the answer was not as clear as he had hoped. Emily Carter, too, was left with a hollow sense of resolution. She had spent so many years plagued by guilt, unsure of what role she had played in Martha's disappearance. The trial had exposed the man who had caused so much pain, but it hadn't healed the wounds. She still remembered the moments of laughter, the long nights studying together, and the way Martha had always pushed her to be better. Emily couldn't forget her, and even now she felt as if the weight of Martha's memory would never leave her. Tom Hayes, on the other hand, seemed to find peace in the smallest ways. He returned to his auto shop, but there was a new sense of purpose in his movements. He didn't talk much about the trial. Instead, he focused on the little things: the hum of his tools, the steady rhythm of his work, the warmth of the sun filtering through the windows of his garage. He would sometimes sit at the old wooden table in his house, staring at the photo of Martha, her bright smile frozen in time. There was a quiet sadness in his eyes, but there was also something else, a kind of understanding. She was finally at rest. The town, too, began to heal. The vigils that once brought so many people together in search of an answer had become something else, a tribute, a place for remembering. Every year the students and townspeople gathered to honor Martha, to ensure that she was never forgotten. And as time went on, Bloomington began to move forward, with the lingering shadow of her disappearance slowly dissolving into the past. But for those who had lived through it, who had seen the weight of the years, the truth never quite felt like enough. They had found justice, but they had lost something along the way. The years spent wondering, the years spent waiting. They couldn't be undone. But they could be understood. And as the sun set over the town with the sounds of everyday life filling the air, it was clear that the past, while painful, would never be erased. It would always remain a part of who they had become. The town of Bloomington had settled back into its rhythms, the kind of quiet that only comes when something unresolved finally finds its end. Time, as it always does, began to heal the wounds left behind by Martha Hayes' disappearance. But it didn't erase them. It never could. The story of the missing college student would always be a part of this place, like a scar that never faded, a story passed down through generations of students who walked the same paths she had once walked. Emily Carter had returned to teaching, a career she had always dreamed of, though now it carried a weight she couldn't shake. She was good at it, patient, kind, but in the back of her mind, Martha's face never left her. It haunted her in the quiet moments, the spaces between sentences. She had never fully forgiven herself for not being there that night, for not being the one who could have saved her. The what-ifs echoed in her thoughts, but they never found an answer. Her office, too, was full of memories of Martha, a photo on the desk, tucked between her lesson plans, reminders of the days before it all fell apart. When students asked about the picture, she'd smile faintly, explaining how it was a memory of a lost friend. Her words never felt like enough to express the depth of what Martha had meant to her. Tom Hayes, though, seemed to find his own path toward peace. His shop had taken on a new life, the sound of tools and the hum of the engine, a constant reminder that, even though the past would never truly leave him, he could keep moving forward. He had stopped coming to the vigils after the first few years, preferring to stay home. He never spoke of Martha to others, but every night he sat by the old photo of her, the light flickering softly in the quiet room. There was one evening, late in the fall, when Emily met Tom in town by the old bookstore. She had returned to visit for the first time in months, standing quietly among the rows of new books and dusty shelves. Tom had found her there, and they shared a cup of coffee, awkward at first, then more natural as the silence between them stretched. "I always thought there'd be more," Emily said, looking out at the street, the same one Martha had walked. "More answers, more something." Tom glanced at her. "Sometimes the truth isn't everything we hope for. Sometimes it's just enough to know we're not alone anymore." They didn't speak much after that, but it wasn't necessary. They both understood. Both of them had learned over the years that the past never truly leaves you. It reshapes you, carves out new parts of who you are, and in that way it lingers, as part of your story, not a separate one. Years later, the small memorial bench dedicated to Martha outside Franklin Hall became a regular stopping point for students. The university had made it a place of remembrance, the small plaque bearing her name and a quote she had once written in her journal. "The truth is not just a story, it's a way to make the world see clearly." It wasn't just about the loss of a life anymore. It was about the legacy left behind, the fight for answers, for justice, and for the truth to be known. And though life moved on, the spirit of Martha Hayes lingered in those who had known her, in the memories of her brightness, her ambition, and her belief in something greater than herself. Her story had become part of the town, a thread woven into its very fabric, never to be forgotten. It had been 10 years since the trial, since the day Martha Hayes's name was finally cleared. Bloomington had long since returned to its rhythm, but for those who had lived through the long silence, life felt different. The town wasn't the same, and neither were the people in it. Time had worked its usual magic, blending the past into the present, but some things, some people, refused to fade. Emily Carter stood in front of the small memorial bench outside Franklin Hall, her eyes resting on the plaque that bore Martha's name. She had returned to visit after several years of avoiding it, reluctant to confront the reality of her own healing. The weather was cool, the trees shedding their leaves, painting the ground in a tapestry of amber and gold. It reminded her of the autumns they had once spent together. Martha would have loved these colors, the crisp air that hinted at the coming winter. Tom Hayes had passed away 2 years ago, quietly and without ceremony, a heart attack that no one had seen coming. Emily had attended the funeral, standing quietly at the back of the church, watching as the man who had once been the beating heart of Bloomington's small auto shop community was lowered into the earth. She had always felt a quiet bond with him, a silent understanding. They had both lost something, a daughter, a friend, and had carried it with them for so long. Blake had retired shortly after the trial, his face weathered by years of chasing a truth that had often seemed too elusive. He had returned to a small house on the outskirts of town, a place that felt quieter without the constant hum of a case hanging over him. His role in Martha's story had been pivotal, but he never saw it as a victory. It was simply the job. The truth was never sweet or satisfying. It was just necessary. As Emily sat on the bench, a soft breeze tugged at her hair, and she closed her eyes for a moment, imagining Martha's voice, the way she had always pushed her to be better, to ask more of herself. The guilt that had gnawed at her for years had finally faded into something else, something softer. A recognition of the fact that life didn't stop for anyone. People moved forward, even when they didn't feel ready to. The campus was bustling with the new generation of students, none of them aware of the story that had once consumed this place. They didn't know Martha's name, but she was there in the air they breathed, in the pavement they walked on, in the very benches they sat on. Her presence lingered like a soft, persistent hum. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the campus. Emily stood and walked toward the main gates, her steps slow but steady, as though she was no longer running from the past, but walking beside it, learning to live with it. She didn't look back at the bench. Martha was never really gone, after all. Her light would always stay in every corner of Bloomington, in every quiet memory, in the heartbeats of the people who loved her. And for the first time in years, Emily felt at peace with that.